talk about how this actually happened. Sure, the governor announced it, but what was the pressure brought on the governor?
Well, that's a tale that could be told as an opera, I think. So we had the good fortune to have a moratorium in place by our previous governor, and I'll let Tony tell some of the details of how that came to be. But because we had pushed the pause button, that gave those of us in the scientific community a chance to begin to really look at the data and the research and what it showed. And we started off with only a handful of studies. There were only 6 studies on the health effects of fracking and the environmental impacts in 2008, for example, when we had the first moratorium declared. Now there are 414 studies and counting, and so it was like we had pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and when you only have a couple of pieces and you try to see what the picture is, it's hard to see, but we saw troubling signs, but it was a little bit like trying to read the tea leaves. And then as more data came in and more studies were done, we talked to more scientists and we knew what the data looked like that was in the pipeline that was coming up to be published. We began to put more pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. Now we have 414 pieces assembled, and even though there are still parts of the picture we can't see very well, what's obvious to us now is that fracking is not only harmful to our water supply and poisons our air and is beginning to actually show signs of and indicators of making people sick, but also that the problems associated with fracking are inherent to the engineering itself and cannot be mitigated in any regulatory framework. So we couldn't see any signs that fracking had been done in a certain way, under certain rules that could govern the safety of it in such that people wouldn't be harmed. And so Tony and I together, as well as a whole bunch of other scientists, we didn't just take that information to our regulatory agencies, although we did that too, because they actually seemed sort of deaf to the science. We started early on taking it directly to the citizenry. So this idea that sort of science and politics exist in 2 separate boxes, I don't think so. I mean, objectivity is one thing, and we're really objective as scientists, but science is not neutral, and it's not a monk that should be sequestered away in a monastery. Science is like a gladiator that should be in the public arena. And so we spent, I don't know, a couple of years every Friday night in church basement somewhere, in a Rotary Club, in a public library, in a junior high school gymnasium, giving PowerPoint presentations with whatever data we had to groups of citizens in small towns all across the state. And so that began then citizen organization, local band movements sprang up. And then, of course, at some point in 2011, 2012, we had so many different anti-fracking groups that we united them then under the umbrella, my organization, New Yorkers Against Fracking. And then Concerned Health Professionals of New York was the sort of science branch of that movement. And at the same time, Tony's shop, Physician Scientists Engineers, a completely separate organization, we began to look at the same data sets. PSE from a statistical point of view, we did the qualitative analysis. We not only brought that out to the people in our compendiums and reports, we sent it to our Department of Health commissioners, first Dr. Shaw, now Dr. Zucker. We sent it to the DEC. We sent it to the governor. So we were constantly bringing data forward to inform the political process.
Well, Sandra,
so that was a big part of it. And,
on that whole
and then, of
issue,
course, musicians and filmmakers all played their own role in captivating the citizenry and uniting us and making us feel like we were on a winning team. I really just want to be really clear and thank the governor for listening to the science, because the part of the pressure he was feeling was the pressure of science, because we equipped the citizenry to bring the science as citizens to their government. And Governor Cuomo then, in the end, said he would let science make the decision, and he sure did. So from my perspective as a scientist in the public interest and as somebody who spent a lot of years in public health, where I see decision makers and political leaders and elected officials not interested in turning away from the science, here's a governor who embraced it and said no and stood up to the gas industry. So all my gratitude to you today, Governor Cuomo.
I mean, this ban is based on health concerns.
Yes, but before I answer that question directly, I want to expand a little bit on what Dr. Steingraber said about how this whole process occurred. It's a perfect example of democracy now. In 2008, where all the other states lying over shale deposits opened the barn doors and let dozens of operators in, absent the science, New York had a special law on the books, an Environmental Quality Review Act, and it took the effort of an individual citizen, Dr. Stan Scobie, to write a brief to Governor Patterson pointing out that that law had to come into effect if shale gas was to be exploited in New York State. That's a perfect example of an individual citizen informing a governor. Governor Patterson wisely took heed and said, okay, let that law go forward, and that led to something called an environmental review, an environmental impact statement. That led to hundreds of thousands of individual comments written by citizens all over New York State that turned back two, not one, actually three at this point, three versions of that environmental impact statement. And as of today, we still do not have a viable, valid environmental impact statement for shale gas in New York State. That's one of the reasons for Governor Cuomo's decision this week. So there's another example of democracy at work. And as Dr. Steingraber just pointed out, while that was happening, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers saying, no, your science doesn't look good to us, the scientists were at work, going from those 6 papers in 2008 to over 400 today. And the second wise governor took office in 2010, Governor Cuomo, and realizing that the science was not yet ready, concluded, obviously, that you don't establish an important energy policy absent good science, especially science having to do with human health. So he waited wisely for the science to catch up, and it almost has. The puzzle is almost complete. We now see what the impacts are, and Dr. Zucker pointed them out in his comments earlier this week. So the science that had to be done, now to answer your question directly, was obvious. What effects through air, through water, through ground movements, through climate change, through leaking wells, through sociological effects on communities, economic effects on communities, ecological effects on communities. What science do we know when shale gas comes to town? And we knew very little in 2008. So some of those studies pointed out that shale gas, unlike previous conventional gas developments, is extremely intense. We have to have many, many wells per square mile, 8, 9, 10 wells per square mile. That means entire regions would have to see tens of thousands of wells. The perspective was that upstate New York was going to be patterned, checkerboard pattern, a pad every mile in one direction, every 2 miles in another direction, as far as the eye could see. And that means that we increase the risk of all the bad things that can happen when you drill a hole in the ground and when you try to extract enormous amounts of natural gas. There can be leaks, there can be failures, there can be transportation problems, there can be pipeline problems, compressor station problems, processor unit problems, storage problems. All of these lead to potential contamination of water supplies, underground drinking water supplies for people in private water wells, which is quite prevalent in upstate New York, and air contamination. We all breathe the same air. We're all downstream, as Dr. Steingraber's book points out. You can't isolate shale gas from the people. It makes the people be part of the shale gas industrial operation. And the people of New York State, using their democratic powers, informed the governors of New York State that they wanted the science to declare whether a policy allowing shale gas development in New York was appropriate. 19.8 million people in this state. On the one hand, their health. On the other hand, the potential and now unrealizable wealth of a few hundred people and a few foreign corporations. I think the decision became very clear for Governor Cuomo this week.